From the Library of Congress in Washington, D.C.
Welcome to the Library of Congress. My name is Steve Winick, and I work here at the American Folklife Center. And we're conducting an interview. My co-interviewer is Mary Sue Twohy from Sirius XM Radio. And our guests are the filmmakers who made the series American Epic, which showed on PBS, and I will let them introduce themselves.
I'm Allison McGourty, one of the writers and producers of American Epic, originally from Scotland, now living in Los Angeles.
And I'm Bernard MacMahon. I'm director and co-writer of the series.
So we understand it took about a decade for you to go from inspiration to the series itself. So the series explores the early days of commercial recording, particularly that burst of activity that occurred with 78 RPM discs all across the country, and particularly roots music. So can you tell us some of the inspirations for making this film?
The period was of great interest to us because in 1925 in America, the vast majority of music was being sold to wealthy people in the cities. That was the audience. And in 26, radio took off in America, and record sales dropped overnight. All those people in Chicago, Boston, and New York started listening to the radio. So the record companies thought, we're going to be out of business. And they came up with the novel idea of why don't we try and sell music to poor people in rural America. But they're not going to be interested in buying the show tunes and the classical music and the big band that we've been recording. We're going to have to record what they like. So they devised a plan, and that was to advertise in local papers across the whole of America, inviting people to come and audition, and thousands of people came. And the auditions were open to all Americans. African Americans, Mexican Americans, Hawaiians, Cajuns, even Native Americans. And some of the guys organizing the sessions were song publishers, so they, like Ralph Pierce, they insisted that people bring their own songs they'd written. And they had just invented at that time, a year before, the first electrical sound recording equipment, the first microphone, the first amplifier. And they were recording everything direct to disc on a pulley-driven lathe, because they couldn't trust the electricity to turn the turntable at a constant 78 RPM. And it took about 3.5 minutes for that weight to slowly fall and hit the floor, which is why today the pop song is still 3.5 minutes long. And that explosion of recordings is what our film is about. It charts the journey of that machine from New York to Oahu, tells us the story through 10 families that participate in those recordings. And then for the fourth film, we rebuild that machine from original parts scavenged over 10 years. And it's the first time anyone's seen it in almost 80 years. And we asked contemporary artists to record on it. So I think the thing that attracted us about this story was it hadn't been told before. And it combined all the things about America that we loved. Its entrepreneurism, its incredibly rich culture, its music, and its freedom of speech.
Mm-hmm. Great. Well, thank you.
Can you tell us a little bit about your background before creating American Epic?
I'll pass that to you first.
Well, I spent 5 years at the BBC in documentaries and acquisition, and also at the BBC World Service, and prior to that at Reuters Television. So I was always interested in storytelling and history and journalism. My dad was a newspaper man, my sister was a journalist, and I played music growing up. So I was surrounded by music as a kid. I played the clarinet, my sister played the flute, and my dad would come on holiday to America and bring back records from the Smithsonian and the Library of Congress and Louisiana. So I grew up listening to jazz and blues and old-time American music. And then when I started working with Bernard, in about 2003-04, we started working together on a record label that then quickly segued into a film company with this project.
Yeah. and I just tagged along in her wake.
So another interesting aspect of this film is there are some names that people will recognize associated with this film. You have executive producers who are T-Bone Burnett, Jack White, and Robert Redford. So how did those big names essentially get involved in this production?
Well, I knew Bob Dylan's manager, Jeff Rosen, and once Bernard had got some really important findings, that some film footage and photographs that we knew had never been seen before and published before, we thought, who better to take it to than Jeff Rosen, who would essentially know if we had a story here and if it was worth telling. So he was the first person we went to, and almost became like a mentor to us in the beginning and helped us. So he thought it was a terrific story. I made an introduction to BBC Arena, to Anthony Wall there, who came on as an executive producer immediately and was a super nice guy, really helpful. And he said, you must take this to T-Bone Burnett. So he made a phone call, and literally Bernard and I found ourselves the very next day flying to Los Angeles for the first time. And we walked into the Village Recorder Studio with our findings, our folder and photographs, and walked into the studio where there was two figures leaning over a sound desk, just finishing off tweaking a record, and they spun around simultaneously, and one was T-Bone Burnett and the other one was Elton John. And Elton said, "Oh, I've been hearing about this project. Do you mind if I sit in and listen?" So we went, "Oh, we'd be delighted." And then we sat down with Elton and T-Bone, and Bernard told the story over about an hour of everything we'd done, where we'd been. At that point, we travelled from Cleveland, Ohio to the Gulf of Mexico, spoken to hundreds of families, and then Bernard, picked up you should take it from there. But
yes, I presented the film idea to them, and I think Elton said at the end of it, he said, "You should become an executive producer to T-Bone on this, right up your street." He said, "If you want me to do anything, just give me a call." And he passed on his numbers. And then a few days later, I had a call from T-Bone, and he said, "I've been talking with a film guy for a few months about who wants to do a music-related project," and I brought him a lot of ideas. He didn't seem interested in any of them. And I mentioned that you come into the studio the other day, and he wants to meet you. So we went down to Santa Monica, and it was Robert Redford. All right. And so I presented that to him.
And he loved it. He said, I think this is America's greatest untold story. And he gave us his offices so we could finish our writing there. So we essentially...
Yeah, it was almost because you were presenting the whole idea of the film. So it's like having a screening in front of a really tough audience before you'd shot a frame, you know? We actually had shot some footage by that stage, but yeah. And then when we came up with the idea to actually do a kind of a proof of theory film, which the fourth film is essentially... I've always had an issue with historical films where a huge amount is based on supposition of what may have happened. And I think that the practical employing of the ideas or what took place is really important to understanding what actually did take place. And if you actually do something, for example, you could make a film in 100 years' time about the Apollo missions, but if you were to actually rebuild that rocket and go to the moon, there would be innumerable things you'd learn about what they must have done that aren't in any books, and that no one alive would remember. And that was the purpose of the fourth film, was to rebuild that machine and then record on it. And this was basically how the way we communicate today began. All the sound on these cameras here, all that technology comes from this machine that no one had seen before now. And so I thought we approached Jack White. I think we wrote to him because we thought he'd be a good person to come and arrange and produce those sessions. I got the impression he liked working with analog gear, which we did. And so I think I wrote him an email. I got his email and I dropped him a line. I think I said something like, I have a photograph of Sun House from 1929 and film footage of Sleepy John Estes from 1938. I think he wrote back in a minute.
Wow, that's quick.
Good hook, yeah.
Yeah. I mean, in his world, that's catnip. You know?
Right, yeah, exactly.
So at the very beginning of American epic and setting the scene in the 1920s, you hear the voice of Robert Redford, and he says, when America first heard itself. I love that phrase.
Mm-hmm.
Can you describe just what that means?
Well, it was coined by a dear friend of mine, Charles Shaw Murray. I sort of said, could you sum up in one sentence what this film's about? I talked to him about many hours, and he kind of goes, let me think. The first time America heard itself. And, of course, as always, he was completely on the money. I'm fascinated, and we both are, with the beginning of things. I mean, my first love was early American cinema, where the language is being invented, you know, from the teens to the 20s to the early 30s, right, as you go through silent, the early talkies. Because that's where, as a filmmaker, you learn the language of film. And similarly in music, this is the point where everything is being invented. Mm. But really, the phrase comes from the fact that, as I told Charles, up until this point, the vast majority of America are not communicating with each other. Okay. The people living in the Appalachians and in Louisiana and in New Mexico, there really is no communication. We don't have talking pictures. There isn't coast-to-coast radio. So these records, when they first appeared, were a method that a woman picking cotton in Mississippi could communicate her ideas about her life to the rest of America. And it was the first time in the history of the planet that the poorest people in the country were given a platform on a nationally distributed medium to express themselves. And it was for entirely commercial reasons. They just wanted, the record men like Ralph Peer wanted to publish songs, i.e. to own the words and the music. So they insisted if you showed up that you brought stuff you'd written yourself, or at least did the courtesy of adapting a traditional song and sticking a few of your own words in it. But you basically meant that for the first time you got all this incredible autobiographical material. The other factor was that the crisis that the record companies were facing from radio in the cities was so serious that they needed to move really quickly. Mm. And so they were going into territories, Cajun being a perfect example, where they couldn't understand a word they were singing. French people can't understand what they're saying. It's perfect French, but the pronunciation's so strange. Mm-hmm. But if they found after a test session that there were a few thousand people that wanted to buy that record, they'd go back again and record more. And so they weren't editing or affecting the content of that material. They were letting people do what they wanted to do. And as long as it sold, they carried on recording more of it. Right. And so, yeah, you had this freedom of speech, this platform for people to come out. And these are people, I mean, imagine if you were working on a plantation in Dockery, and suddenly you're in this tiny rural community, you can't leave, and suddenly you're on a record that is being distributed around the whole country, and that people to this day are still covering. Right. I don't, if that isn't freedom of true freedom of speech, I don't know what is. So that, I think that's why it's the first time America heard itself. Yeah. And it actually became a model as to how the world heard itself, because the rest of the world picked up on that. Mm-hmm.
And they were writing songs about their everyday lives, their love lives, local politics, stories of murders in their local town, and it was a method of sharing their stories with the world.
And the thing that's different is that the Library of Congress, organised these, with John Lomax, these amazing recording trips. These are non-commercial trips, right. And there's a huge amount of value many years later that have been discovered from the songs and things that are recorded in these trips. But this, I think, was much more exciting thing, because these were commercial recordings. People wanted these to be heard by as many people as possible. They drew amazing adverts depicting the lyrics of the songs. The idea was to get this in front of as many people. And so it really meant that you had blues musicians listening to country musicians listening to blues musicians, Hispanic musicians listening to Cajun musicians. Everyone was hearing everyone else for the first time. Mm-hmm. So it basically made American music and communication way richer.
Mm-hmm. So was there were there particular challenges involved in making what's essentially a visual film about sound?
It's almost impossible, because when we started, there was literally no archive at all. I would say half of, I haven't added up the figure, at least a third of the subjects of our film, there was no known photograph of them when we started. So that meant there might be a prospect there may never be a photograph of them. We researched over 100 musicians and groups that recorded, and then whittled it down to 10 for the film. But yeah, it was an enormous detective job, and so...
I remember in the early days saying to Bernard, it looks here like we've got a really good radio show.
Yeah, right.
Because there was no footage at that time of any of the artists that we wanted to tell the story of, so finding enough material for Bernard to make the film was...
Yeah, so it involved going through it. It's now, I'd say, probably I would say it's the biggest archive in the world of material relating to that era, in terms of the stills that we have and the audio and the private tape recordings of these people speaking and all the documentation, along with the machine itself. But I think it started actually as a kind of just a fascination with trying to track down some of the people, you know. So I think one of them was I'd love this song Henry Lee by Dick Justice, yeah. And so I started running. I wanted to find him.
He was in the charts at the time.
Yeah, it was in the charts.
Nick Cave and PG Harvey.
And so I just started. I started running stories in all the. He was believed to have come from West Virginia, so I just started running stories in local papers in West Virginia in the mining communities, because that was all that was known of him, that he might have been a miner from West Virginia. And then must have run about 6 stories, and then I ran one in a paper called the Logan Banner, and that resulted in the editor calling me and saying an old man's left his number, and it was a guy called Bill Williamson, a lovely man, and he said, I know Dick Justice's daughter, she's quite elderly, but here's her number. And so I called her up, and she was really shocked to get a call from England about her dad, and she had no idea that her dad's songs had been covered and were known to around the world. And she talked about him going down the mines and how they had the musicians had auditioned over the telephones to record companies because they couldn't get to the standard auditions that everyone else went to. And she said she revealed she only had one picture of him, which was this sort of embossed plaque that's in the book. And I think we arranged a car to travel 100 miles to this little community to pick up the picture and take it to the nearest place that could photograph it. And I called Bill back to thank him, and he said, well, my dad was also in a group, and they were called the Williamson Brothers and Curry, and I knew them. They did the first ever John Henry recording. Right. And he had all these incredible stories. And I think we started looking for some more people, and after that Allison said this should be made into a film. This is the last time these people are going to be alive that can tell this story. And then with our producer and co-writer Duke, we started in earnest to really track down the musicians we personally felt the strongest connection with.
Yeah, I mean, one sort of heartbreaking moment in the film is when you're talking to, I guess it's Dick Justice's son, and he says, I never even knew that my father had recorded these songs. I knew he played the piano and sang in church, but you'd think I would have heard him sing one of these songs at some point in his life, and I never did.
Yeah. It's one of the things that was most beautiful about doing this film, something I never expected, was that we would be going into communities and meeting families that didn't know about these records, but they knew about them playing music, maybe locally, or that they had an interest in music. And so you would often sometimes be playing these records to people for the first time. And so what was amazing to me was that we were bringing something that they really wanted too. And they were giving them all this amazing memories and stories. Sometimes, I think our oldest interview was 104. So we were catching these people before they moved on to the next world. Right. And that was the most that was the most pleasing part, was to give all the research that you'd put together, including the music, to them, and then telling you the background of what they knew about how this had happened.
One of the themes of American epic is how recording technology has changed the world, in terms of in radio for one, and then, of course, the technology of recording music.
Well, yeah. I mean, that's the film is is multifaceted. It deals with a lot of things that I think is equally important, and the technology is as important as the content. In fact, it defines the content, and we in this moment here our conversation is being shaped by the limitations of being recorded and sitting on a chair with a lavalier mic and what have you. And the thing about this recording machinery was, this machinery, when you work with this recording system, it favors small groups, vocal-led groups are what sound good on it, and guitar-based things particularly. The microphone likes it. So our sense of it is that the emergence of the small group, be it a popular group, a country group, or even a jazz group, is because that sounded good on that machine. And whereas opera and that kind of music was much bigger in the acoustic era, when you were shouting into a horn, because you needed huge amounts of volume. This, in 26, when this machine was invented, it allowed you to capture very subtle nuances. And so performers that were singing very quietly and performing delicately could be captured on it. And then people actually started to exploit that sounded really good in it, the intimacy of this. And so, yeah, I think it fundamentally shaped the way all music is to this day. And now recording technology that's followed on from it, by most really hardcore engineers, consider the technology today in many ways inferior. It is purity in recording technology. Everything, the purer it is, the less parts you're moving through between the signal coming in and the end product, the better. And this is very simple. So people that are really big audio buffs would love this amplifier for its simplicity. But yeah, I think it shaped the way we communicate. And this is the really interesting thing in relation to, say, what we're filming here today. Hollywood had been resisting for years putting sound on motion pictures, but they relented in 27 with, and I think one of the factors in this was that this machine was putting electrical sound recordings all around America in the poorest homes, where the people were listening to them on little wind-up record players. And I think this, amongst other things, was one of the factors that allowed Western Electric to go back to Hollywood and go, how can you not have sound on talking pictures? You have the whole country listening to electrical sound recording. So it's impossible to even overstate how important this machine is to how we communicate today.
Wow.
So you talked about the small group, and one of those sort of iconic small groups from that era was the Carter family. So what do you think is, there have been a lot of books and other things written about that particular group. What do you think is your take on the Carter family that's different in this film?
Well, that is a female group. We're not taking anything away from A.P. Carter in the film. But if you listen to interviews with Sarah and Maybelle, we've been through everything that exists as far as we know. They talk that they found a lot of songs themselves, and a lot of the early repertoire was theirs. And essentially, it's a female duo. I mean, A.P. is often not present on a lot of the recordings, and they will often joke that he would just wander off in the middle of a recording session and just look out the window. And so the Carter family struck me as a female group, and that in itself, in 1927, and in the country medium, is an unusual thing. And it's a pretty emancipatory female group. It's like a strong, powerful female group. So I think that was the shading on the story, that I mean, I literally, the way we approached these stories was just, we wanted to let the families that knew these people tell these stories in their own words. And our sense was that historians in places like New York, some of whom may never have visited the Appalachians, as my Kentucky friends always tell me it should be pronounced,
Right.
they would, there would be all these theories and concepts about what would happen. And so after we traveled extensively in America, it felt the appropriate thing to let the families themselves tell the stories. And my feeling was, we just wanted the viewers to feel what we felt as we spent time with these people. And if you're with the son of somebody that has grown up their whole life with this person, not only do they have a lot of their father or their mother in them, they often speak like them, they often think like them. And this is the closest way for another person to touch the beating heart of that story when that person is long passed away. Mm-hmm. And so our sense was, let them tell the story. And so really the stories as they are really how they see them. It's the accumulation of how they depict that. And so I think our sense of the Carter family story was that it was very much he was the driving force in terms of getting them to the session, but it was a female group, essentially, in terms of its records and its performance.
Interesting.
How did you find the connection between Elder Birch and Dizzy Gillespie?
Can we do this?
Yeah. That was a lot of detective work that you did for a long time.
Well, all these stories come out of a love of a particular record, and I think we become, if you saw a beautiful girl or a handsome, dashing man walking along the street, you'd become curious about them, you know, and it's that kind of, it's the music that draws you in. And so if you're interested, I heard this record, My Heart Keeps Singing, and I just thought it was just this beautiful, beautiful record. And I thought, if we do a gospel piece in the film, we have to put this song, My Heart Keeps Singing, in there. It was only a few years later that Taj Mahal explained to me why I loved that song. I grew up in a West Indian neighbourhood in South London, and he said, this comes from St. Kitts, this song. This is a Caribbean song. Well, this is a West Indian song. If you didn't know the song, he said, just the style of singing. And I listened to it, and I grew up as a child listening to reggae, and I went, oh my God, that's why I like this. It sounded like the songs that my Jamaican friends would play, their parents would play. And so I loved this song, and I was this voice in me said, we need to put this song on the film, but we need to at least know something about who made it. And all that we had was on the record label. It said Elder J.E. Birch and Congregation. And I remember asking around all the different people I could find that were into gospel music, and nobody had heard of Birch. They knew him, they knew the name, but no one knew anything about him. And so I went to the archive in the basement of Sony Records and went through their recording ledgers.
What was that like? I mean, did you have to go an elevator down floors?
Yes, it's deep in the basement, and and it is these rows and rows of boxes containing the recording ledgers of each session. So at these sessions, back in the teens even, there would be someone with a typewriter that would be typing up the songs that were done and making notations about it.
And thank God that they did that.
Yes.
Them.
And eventually I found in this box Birch, and it listed the songs, and there was just one piece of information in the corner. It just said Chiraw, misspelt, North Carolina, I think it said. It's South Carolina, I believe. But anyway, and there was no indication what that meant other than it was a place. There was no indication that Birch had come from there, but it was all we had. So
that's it.
Yeah. And so I think, one of the reasons that, doing this at the Library of Congress is appealing to me is I want to say this project was only possible because of librarians. Because anytime we found an obscure town, the first thing we'd do is call the town library. And librarians are the most universally helpful people at trying to find the person in the town that might know what you're trying to find. And librarians also seem to get very curious about the call from England about a member of their community they've never heard of. So that's a big, I just want to say that if it wasn't for the librarians of America, there wouldn't be an American epic, because so many of these things were unearthed because of a genial elderly old librarian that kind of was in, Birch, I've never heard of him. I must find out about him. Someone in London knows about him, you know. So anyway, we went to Chiraw, and nobody knew anything about Birch, and eventually we were told to speak to an African-American town elder. And we went over to the poor part of town, and we met this lovely man, Ted Bradley. And Bradley remembered Birch. And
He was lovely too, wasn't he?
He's a gorgeous
just
man.
Had this shine about him.
He really did.
Yeah.
There's he's like he's one of the great flowers of America, you know. Wonderful fellow.
We'd been there for 2 weeks. We first of all stayed with, it was our evening before we were leaving. We were having a farewell dinner, and we'd failed in our mission. We hadn't found any leads, and we walked into this restaurant that's only opened a couple of nights, and somebody put us in touch. One of the people that worked there made a phone call and said, "Oh, you need to stay. This person knows him." And so we extended our flight, and that was the next day. We went over the other side of the tracks and met Ted Bradley. So it was just in the nick of time.
Yeah.
And
so,
he knew Birch.
Yeah, so he'd gone to that church, and he described that the church was this kind of rollicking affair, and that he was not a sanctified church member. And so he said he would have been punished by his parents if they'd known as a little boy he was sneaking into this church. But the music was so good, he was drawn to it. And he mentioned that the music was so powerful that white people, after they'd been to their church, would all sit in their cars in the trees around the little wooden triumph church that Birch had built with his bare hands, and listen to the music all afternoon. And so it brought the white and black members of the town together. And with Levi Bird, Birch was one of the people that set up the NAACP, and in South Carolina. And Chiraw became quite an emancipated town, and I think that church was a big factor in spreading connecting the races together. And so, but we still didn't have a photograph of Birch, and we were then introduced to Ernest Gillespie, and he was a friend of Ted Bradley, and Ernest had also, as a little boy, snuck into that church and listened to all the stomping and the shouting. And when we met him, he said, "Well, you know who was really influenced by this music? It was my cousin who lived like next door, Dizzy Gillespie."
That's amazing.
Yeah, and he pulled out this autobiography by Dizzy. It was long out of print, and no one's ever seen this connection in there. And said, "Look in here." And he talks about Birch's church being the big inspiration for him, and going to hear that's where he understood about rhythm and melody and spiritual transport through music through going to that church.
Yeah, I think that was a kind of a really great moment in this film, because it really is true that Elder Birch's recordings are known among the sort of record aficionados, and of course Dizzy Gillespie is revered among everyone who studies American music. And the connection was there to be made, but nobody made it before, because he wrote about Elder Birch in his book. So it was great that you found that and were able to bring that out in the film.
Exactly. Yeah, and I think it's just, so I think what I liked about the story, and the story for the audience, was that in your own communities there are those little pieces of string that if you start pulling them could easily lead to a story like this. Right. And they're all over America. And this is an example of a guy that's just known for this one record, but it transpired he was a pivotal influence upon the most important musicians of the 20th century. Right. You know, and yeah. So, you know, and the Joseph Kikuku story is the same.
Well, I was just going to ask about that, because the Kikuku story has been somewhat known among ethnomusicologists and the like, and many of them don't actually think he invented the slide in the sense that it's part of African music, and so a way for it to get to the blues that's more obvious than Hawaiian music would be just through African roots. Although obviously the style of playing steel guitar is something that he did invent. So what is your take on that, and on the slide question?
It doesn't, the steel bar played on a guitar, it doesn't exist in any form that I'm aware of before he started playing it. The earliest record I found of it was in the 30s. A musician called C.S. Delano wrote in I tracked down a guitar and banjo mag published in Britain, and he recalls Kikuku talking about when he came up with the idea and how he propagated it. And that's by far the earliest writing about that. And then the first ever book in the teens of slide guitar playing or steel guitar playing is by Myrtle Stumpf, and she was one of Kikuku's pupils. So I'm not aware of that, and I'm not aware of anything that precedes it that is played in a similar fashion. Mm-hmm. And then the other thing to remember as well with this is that there's no way to be absolute about these things. Sure. And I think that's a kind of the desire of historians, is to be there to be an absolute truth. Oftentimes you can have situations where two people are working on the same scientific problem solving or theory on opposite ends of the world, and one may popularize that theory before the other. Mm-hmm. But in this instance, it's pretty clear that after the World's Fair in San Francisco, there were extensive tours organized all across America with Toots Packer that Kikuku played with. And the newspaper, if you go through the newspaper cuttings through the teens, you can see this tour going everywhere. And it's a big sensation. There's no musician that we worked with, that we tracked down, that has as much publicity as Kikuku is, which is incredible given how until this film came out, he was largely completely forgotten. But that tour was organized by a big theatre promoter at the time. And it meant that thousands and thousands of people heard that musical style. And Kikuku toured Europe and around the world. He played in the Birds of Paradise show. Right. And I believe that is how people heard that music. And I think that's how that playing got to the Delta. People in the Delta heard when the Toots Packers group toured there, they heard that music and wanted to do it themselves. And really, if you look at it, if you see someone playing it, it's not that difficult to do. If you play guitar and you hear this incredible sound that is made simply just by flipping the guitar on its side and then running a bolt across it, I mean, most people that are musicians would go back and go, let me figure out how he did that, you know? And it wouldn't take very long to realize you just need to raise the strings up a bit and get a smooth object. So I think really those tours were what propagated it around America. I'm not aware of any other musical unit that was spreading that idea, because by the early 20s, Hawaiian music was one of the most popular forms of music in America. So there's no any evidence whatsoever that points to anyone other than Kikuku originally being the person that propagated that. Right.
So I probably did this backwards, but I should say that the Kikuku story is about Joseph Kikuku, a great Hawaiian guitarist who's said to have created what we call Hawaiian steel guitar, and also steel guitar in general coming through that. And that's, I think, undisputed. The only question among ethnomusicologists has been whether another form of slide playing existed with the guitar, which would have been essentially bottleneck slide playing on one string as opposed to across all the strings. And that's something that ethnomusicologists have kind of argued about. So I probably did that backwards. I should have had you tell the Kakuku story first, and then and then just bring up that point. But it is in a way a minor point in the sense that all that you're saying is certainly undisputed, that he started what we think of as steel guitar.
I would be fascinating if someone presented a recording or serious documentation showing somebody using a smooth bar on an upturned guitar prior to Kakuku. If such documentation exists, it'd be fascinating to see it. There's no doubt he invented I've always found the distinction between the steel guitar played on all the strings and the bottleneck. I don't see a huge difference between them in terms of the concept's the same.
Right.
But yeah, I'm just not aware of anyone doing it. Who do they cite as being the person that...
Well, essentially what they cite is the fact that slides are used in African music on a whole range of stringed instruments, including musical bows. And the diddly bows were known in the South, and so a more obvious way of getting to the bottleneck slide in Southern African American music would have been straight from Africa, as opposed to it coming in from Hawaii. But there's no way to prove it, because, as you say, I don't think any recording of specifically a guitar being played with a slide exists before Joseph Kakuku's recording. So.
Yeah, and all the country usage, which is in the same regions, is clearly Hawaiian based of the steel guitar. You know.
What was it like to hear the slide guitar on the recording? You mentioned something about it just it being a very good experience.
It was wonderful. And Bernard had discovered this record with Joseph Kakuku, I think one of the earliest recordings. I think it was from the late teens, wasn't it?
Well, Tejano mentions in his article that Kakuku he'd appeared on records with this group called Leighton and Johnston, which were an African American group that went over to Britain and started making these kind of music hall numbers, all dressed in tuxedos, and the King was a big fan of theirs, and they said that he played on 3 of their records, and everything he had said in his article that I checked out panned out. And so I went on the search for these records, and it took something like 2 years to find one of them. They were the hardest records to find. The internet is saturated with the Leighton and Johnston records from Britain, but not those titles. And eventually one showed up, and we dubbed it, and halfway through there comes his slide guitar, which is kind of incredible. So in the film, we brought that to Oahu, and because no one's ever heard Joe the Kakuku play, and played it to the family for the first time. So it was the first time anyone on Oahu's ever heard alive has heard what he sounds like.
And to answer your question about what it felt like, when you hear the music in the place that it came from, it touches you differently. It feels right. So it sounds different in Hawaii itself than it does in London. And we noticed that everywhere we went, with all the different kinds of music in the place where the music was created, you can tell, you can sense it's right. That's where it belongs.
Wow. So the landscape and where it originated was really, truly important.
Absolutely, yes. So the rhythms of the Mississippi.
We called it geographonics.
Yes.
That music sounds like the place it comes from, and you can hear the landscape in the music, and you can also only truly understand the music when you go to the place it was made. So as a Londoner, you only ever really truly understand jazz, modern jazz, when you're sitting in a New York taxi cab and it's playing. That was the first time I understood jazz. Truly. I'd liked it, but I didn't understand it. And the Native American music, the Hopi songs, I was fascinated by them, but when I went to Hopi, which is one of the strangest places on the planet I've ever visited, those songs suddenly sounded like pop songs when I was there. I know they're sacred songs, but they sounded catchy to me. And once I left Hopi, I started humming the songs.
Interesting.
And I couldn't even follow the melody line of the songs originally. They just interested me. But once I'd been there in that geography and playing that song as we drove around or wandered around Hopi, I was like, oh, this basically sounds like this landscape.
It's fascinating.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And Louis Michaud talks about that as well in the other film, where he talks about the Cajun music and croche, the word croche, crooked, the music reflects the environment in which it comes from.
Yeah, Cajun music,
Yeah.
which is a little strange to other people's ears, is really commercial when you're in Louisiana. It sounds exactly like the place.
Right.
Yeah.
So you get little strange little rivulets going everywhere, and swamps and strange things crawling out of them. This slightly odd music sounds exactly right there, you know? Yeah, and I guess
Very cool,
yeah. So yeah, I think a lot of art is mirroring our environment, and it's entirely affected by the environment. We're kind of responding, and it's at its best when it's that, I think.
San Antonio, Texas. That became kind of a hub for record companies in the 1920s. And that is where Lydia Mendoza and her family first recorded. You actually met with some of her relatives and got to visit with them. Can you tell us a little bit about that experience?
The Hernandez family. They're Lydia's grandchildren, and they live in San Antonio. And the house, they're wonderful. It's Roger and
Anne McKinney.
and their dad Fernando, and the house is almost partly like a shrine to their grandmother.
Wow.
So they had more photographs and memorabilia related to her than I think almost any other family we met in researching this film.
Wow.
And she had obviously been this huge, larger-than-life figure. And they, when you were with them, they almost spoke in hushed tones about her, as if she could walk in the door at any moment and go, "What are you saying about me?" So she was a woman that cast a long shadow. And I really liked that. That's why I kind of wanted the audience, I hope the audience got a little sense of that in the films, was this woman, she felt like she just left the house. And she's, she died a long time ago. And so I found them really kind of really wonderful people to hang out with, and I think I like the idea. I love the idea of all these different stories being next to each other. Because I think American culture is that's what makes American culture really exciting. Is the Hispanics next to the Cajuns, next to the Native Americans, next to the African Americans and the Hawaiians. So it was almost like being hit by this emotional tsunami traveling from these places, because when you arrive to film, it would often be the result of many meetings, many phone conversations, a really close relationship built up with these people, and then this explosion of them telling the story on camera. And you'd be just inundated with all this stuff and these new things they'd found, and then you'd be on to the next place and into their world.
Well, one thing you might find cool is that Lydia Mendoza performed in this building in 1977 or 78. I can't remember the exact year, but she performed in the Coolidge Auditorium, which is right in the building where you're sitting here.
This was for Carter's inaugural, wasn't it? Was she here for that as
It
well?
may have been, yeah.
She
It
was
may
here
have
for
been.
Jimmy Carter's inaugural. So that was... she was. I've forgotten the specific question about what was it about?
Well, we were just kind of talking about how it was meeting with her family, and you described that. But I also want to know about the dresses. She made her dresses, and did you see one on premise?
Yeah, she made the dresses, and the family talk about how there was always sequins all over the place. and I met the family again this year when I went down to San Antonio for the ARSC annual meeting, and we invited the family in to talk, and they got to see the cut of her story for the very first time with the audience at that meeting. So that was wonderful, and they were that brought a tear to their eye as well, and they were just so thrilled to have their family honoured like that and have people remember.
Yeah.
That's the best bit of the film, is screening it for the families.
Sure.
Yeah.
And getting the approval of the people that it's about. I mean, actually, as a filmmaker, that's the thing you really care about, is that they think it's true, you know. And actually, most families are they're very open. If you know, the story doesn't have to be sugarcoated. If there's nasty, tough bits to it, it's you know.
Brendan, what was it like though in Sedona? I didn't come to that screening with the Hopi when you got their blessing.
Yeah. So I'd invited Lee, who's in the film, who's
Kawanisiwa.
yeah, and he's a very, very senior Hopi, and to come to, we were asked to do a
Sedona
screening
Film
at the Sedona Film Festival, and I thought, well, let's do this. This will be an opportunity to show Lee the film before it airs. And we go to this theatre, and I'm expecting there to be like 20 people there or something, and it's absolutely packed. And the film director says, "Oh, we invited Lee to a few things, but he never comes. He won't come, surely." And he shows up, and this is very friendly and goes in, and I'm sitting next to him, and the film starts, and I was thinking, thank God I put the Hopi story at the beginning of this film, because I don't want to wait for 40 minutes for his reaction. And I think about 10 minutes through, he started laughing at something out loud. And then he kind of leant over and tapped me on the arm like this. And then the screening got to the end. It was a very kind, wonderful reception. And then someone was asking us questions, and they ran up to the back of the theatre and put a mic in front of Lee. And this was obviously a very big deal. He had shown up. He apparently doesn't show up at these things. And they said, "What do you think of it?" And he goes, I think it's wonderful, and I give it my full blessing. You know, that was a very meaningful moment. And he was very kind. He let us use. We showed him all the footage we were planning on using, and gave us permission to use it. And so it was because I said, "Look, we found some amazing things you see in the film, the performance on the steps of Congress." But I said, "Are we okay to use this? It's your call."
Where did that footage come from?
Yeah.
This was like another detective story, like like a whole film, I suppose. I had basically, I was fascinated in this record. It was one of the first electrical sound recordings of Native American music, and I knew a tiny bit about the Hopi, and I know very little more since I did that film.
And it was called the Hopi
Indian Chanters.
Oh, okay, and the title of the
the title of the record was Chant of the Eagle Dance and Chant of the Snake Dance. And the snake dance is the most sacred Hopi ritual, and that is used to bring rain to the desert. So it is essential, that song, for their survival.
And it's a private,
entirely secret private ceremony.
Yep.
So a friend of Allison's flew us to Flagstaff when we found out about a Hopi convention that was happening in Flagstaff, where all the Hopi elders were meeting to discuss preserving their language. They were worried that the younger generation may not stop speaking Hopi. So we went there and met them, and I met a Hopi called Satala, and I played him the songs, and he sort of said, "Well, that's not the snake dance. That's the eagle dance. And the eagle dance is not the eagle dance, that's the buffalo dance."
So they're inaccurate labelings on the Victor recordings for the title of the...
Well, they're entirely what the Hopi wanted Victor to call them.
Exactly.
But this, I hope, comes across in the film. The wonderful thing about the Hopi is they don't feel the rest of the world needs to know their business. Right. It doesn't really help stuff for them, So I got to try and respect that. And it's a little message that we don't have to look under every rock. Right. We should let certain people be if they want to be. Let them do their thing. They're certainly not in an area where they're bothering anybody, Right. They've chosen to be in the toughest place on the planet, or one of them. I wanted to find, so I started searching around for this, and eventually I tracked down that Billingsley was a white guy that traveled to Hopi, and he had befriended them and lived at Hopi, and Congress were attempting to ban the snake dance, and they felt that if they could ban the snake dance, it would basically pull the heart out of Hopi, and that tribe, which was resistant to being integrated or being messed with, they felt, as Lee says, if they could break the religion, they'll break the tribe. And so they were moved in Congress to get the snake dance banned because it involves, carrying snakes in the mouths of dancers, and they argued that it was barbaric. It's not barbaric to snakes or anything, but it was just as Lee puts it was a mechanism that they saw of destabilizing the tribe. And so Billingsley, rightly or wrongly, decided that if he brought the Hopi and toured America with them and showed their rituals, it would bring an acceptance that these rituals weren't a threat to anybody. And so they went to Victor and made recordings, which I think to make them more commercial. They wanted it to be the snake dance, but obviously no white people had any idea what they were listening to. And so it was another dance. And then they brought them to Congress, like a few weeks later. So they were on this tour. And I found newspaper reports of them dancing on the steps of the Capitol. And so really, essentially, it was purely a gut instinct that there might have been a newsreel camera there. And zero showed up until we eventually went through some archives in North Carolina that had thousands and thousands of feet of unused Fox movie tone newsreel. This is where the unedited newsreels went, things that weren't cut into newsreels. And buried in there was footage from a Fox movie tone newsreel.
That's amazing.
That is amazing.
So it was just an instinct going, I think someone might have been there with a because I'd found a picture of the crowd, and the crowd was huge, which I show in the film. I'd found that, and that in itself was eureka. And then looking at it after a couple of weeks, I was like, it has to be a movie camera. And it was still a silent film, but I think there would be the camera there. I was going through the thing with a magnifying glass, and I couldn't see a movie camera, but yeah.
Did you shout when you found it?
Oh my God! And the footage you see is stunning.
It is stunning.
And then I showed
it. It's amazing
I didn't
footage,
tell
yeah.
Lee I was going to show it to him.
Yeah, it looks like it was shot yesterday, except for being black and white.
Because it'd never been used since it was developed. It'd never been in a projector before.
Wow.
It'd never been transferred. So a lot of the footage in the film's like that. It's unseen. And so I thought when I interviewed Lee, I'd never even told him about the footage. I thought I'll just show him it and see what he thinks. And he was, very moved by it. And he was obviously shocked because he'd heard about the event, but he didn't think they'd actually done the snake dance there. He thought they'd done a fake ceremony.
Right.
Thinking the white people won't know the difference. But you saw he was moved to tears when he saw they actually had to do the ceremony. Wow. And so to him, he felt that was something that the rest of the world should see, that the Hopi shouldn't have had to do that in order just to continue doing something they'd been doing for so long.
Yeah. So one of the connections for me that was really interesting, just because it's not something you would not necessarily think of, was to find out that Charlie Musselwhite was mentored by Will Shade of the Memphis Jug Band. So talk about jug band music a little and how that sort of dominates part of that first film.
I love it. I mean, I'm obsessed with the Memphis Jug Band. I see the Memphis Jug Band as like the first black pop group. I think they're absolutely brilliant. I love everything about them. That was one story that was like, we're doing them. I don't care if there's nothing we don't know anything about Will Shea. We're doing this group. People have to hear this music. And it so obviously is a precursor of R&B and hip hop. Everything's in there.
Right.
Even links to skiffle.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. I mean, that's what skiffle.
Yeah.
They called it skiffle back in the 20s.
Right.
I thought skiffle was something my mum used to like, But yeah, that's where that comes from. And we all know the Beatles were a skiffle band, or some of them were originally. Yeah. So Will Shade. So the question was, how do I tell this story? There were like 2 pictures of Will Shade in existence, and pretty much nothing else. Wow. There are a few fragments of an interview that Paul Oliver did.
Right.
But he really was, for someone that was like a huge, big music-selling artist with masses of records that have been covered by all these people, there was very, very little known about him. And so I tramped with Allison around Memphis, repeatedly trying to find anybody that knew him. I knew from the census records, I found him in the census records, that he didn't have children. So that really makes things very difficult. And there was nobody alive that remembered him, even though he died in 1966. It feels like Memphis something happens in Memphis, things get swept away, unlike any other city I've been to in America. And you really got a sense after 3 visits, even though it's 66, which in historical terms is not long ago, it felt like this is gone. This has just been, it's like Katrina's come in and just swept this away, any memory of this. All the houses where they lived were knocked down, the area he lived in. And so I was literally about to give up until my friend Garth Cartwright, an author in Britain, said, I think Charlie Musselwhite is a friend of mine, knew him. And I was like, it just seemed too good to be true that a kind of well-known musician would actually know this dude after we'd tramped over the city. And I called Charlie and he went, my God, yeah, there were 2 guys that were my big influences in Memphis, It was Will Shade and Elvis Presley. And so Charlie would be going to this really, really poor neighborhood and learning to play from Will Shade. And then he would go to a fun fair late at night that Elvis Presley had rented out. And I just thought, wow, the dichotomy between those 2 musical worlds, But yeah, so Charlie, and it felt to me like it was that became a story of mentorship. So a lot of these stories are emotional stories, and the music's emotional. People can take all this information now and go into much detailed historical treatises and put all the bits together. But to me, I love the story of this music being handed down to this boy that was visiting his house.
And he was a boy when he first met Will Shade.
He was, yeah.
Tell us about where you filmed Charlie when he was talking about Will Shade.
All the people in the film are filmed on location in a place that is very significant to the story. So there are no interviews that are like we are here, just against the backdrop. Although we are in a place, this is the Library of Congress. So a bad example, but not in the studio.
Lydia was here. Lydia was here.
Yes, this is the perfect place. But yeah, most interviews, you're brought into a studio and you're interviewed. We wanted to interview Charlie in a club that Will Shade would have played in on Beale Street, and all the clubs had been knocked down on Beale Street. Pee-wees and everywhere, apart from one, the Monarch, which was owned by Jim Canane, who was a big kind of mafiosi type guy in Memphis. Old Jim Canane's the place was there. In fact, there's even a song on our box set by Robert Wilkins called Old Jim Canane's. It's about that going to that club and sniffing cocaine and having a wild old time.
Clubs. These were
very rough.
Yeah.
And Will Shade and the Memphis Jug Band were the house band, and we found the building. And as we peered into the building, it was a police station. And so,
the irony.
Yes. But for some strange reason, the downstairs of the club was largely untouched. It was just the same walls and brickwork, and the police stored their bicycles there.
And you can see where the
upstairs floor, and you can see where the bar was.
Yeah.
And the upstairs floor was the actual police station. When we went into the police station, they were so bemused and intrigued of what the history of the club was that they let us basically empty out the entire police contents of the ground floor and set up a makeshift studio there. So yeah, we filmed Charlie on the very club floor that Will would have played in the 20s, and 30s. So yeah, all the places are shot like that. In the church at Chiror, on the steps of Maybelle Porter's house. So really, just as a filmmaker, your hope is to bring people to the place on a film where the story happened, to be talking to the family and just to have a sense, to create a sense of what it would be like if you went and spent an afternoon with Dale Jett sitting on his porch and he's telling you the story and he's effectively bringing out the photographs and the film clips and showing them to you. And that's all we wanted to do, was to create that sense of you going into the place where it happened. With the people that knew those people, their blood, and they're telling you that story. And if they don't have blood, they're protégés,
Exactly.
And so I think with Charlie, it's emotive when you're in that place, when you're in that room. There are emotions that are strong, and you could feel it in the way he talked, the way he sings his song. He knows that Will was in that room.
At one point, he breathes in deeply and just sort of takes in the air of the room, and in all its history.
Yeah.
And completely enjoys that moment.
Yeah, it's absolutely real. That's just him.
Yeah.
He just literally did that. You know, he was like, he knew what it meant to be in there. And I think it was, we had a very funny moment I really wanted to put in the film, but it just couldn't fit. Was we wanted to go and visit Will Shade's grave and have Charlie leave a memento for Will on the tomb, harmonica or some such. And so we get to this cemetery that Will's buried outside Memphis, and there is yellow ticker tape around the whole cemetery, and just mountains of police cars piled up. And we're like, what went on here? And they go, the cemetery's a crime scene. and Charlie turned to me and went, only in Memphis would the cemetery be a crime scene. And he said, I said, what? I said to the policeman, so what do you mean a crime scene? He goes, well, the owners of the cemetery, the people running the cemetery, have been doing illegal things with the bodies, removing them, reburying them.
I remember this story.
And they expected it.
Crazy.
I said, when do you think you'll be done? He said, it was like, we expect this to be a crime scene for another couple of years. Trying to figure out all the, I mean, literally Burke and Hare stuff, like digging up corpses. And Charlie sort of stood outside on camera and played his harmonica song to Will outside the cemetery. And he just said, he looked up and he said, this is a Will Shade joke. Yeah. He said, you didn't come and see me enough when I was alive. You certainly ain't going to come and see me when I'm dead.
But that relationship between Charlie and Will Shade kind of brings up another issue that I think is a sort of an undercurrent to a lot of the film, but it's you don't get very explicit about it, which is the question of race. That you know there was probably more musical interplay among African Americans and white Appalachian folks, for example, than is evident from the records themselves, and yet there's also all kinds of racial tension and racial issues going on. And I mean, an example that came up in the film was when Mississippi John Hurt wanted to hear his record, and his neighbor, you know, played it for him, and he stood outside the window and listened to her, listened to it playing through the window rather than just going into her house as would be normal now. So, how do you feel that the story of race is told through this music as well?
Well, the records are not in themselves an entirely accurate representation. They're a piece. Talking to the old musicians that you may recall in the film, we interviewed the three oldest blues musicians in the world. Robert Lockwood and Honeyboy and Homesick, who I think was 98 or was 98 then. And Lockwood's made it clear that, you know, those musicians would have repertoires for white audiences as well as black audiences, and that they were very fluent in country music and music that would appeal to white audiences. But obviously there were white audiences that enjoyed listening to blues as well. Mm-hmm. And I think that those issues are implicit in a film, in being in that environment. I mean, there's a moment that I was discouraged by the broadcaster to put in the film, which was when Charlie Patton's relatives go to Dockery and they meet Bill Lester, who's the owner of Dockery, and there is this interesting and uncomfortable conversation where the current curator of a plantation is telling the history of their relative to them on a plantation where their family worked. And I felt that scenario was enough to tell you about the interesting and uncomfortable situation at that time. However, the most important thing that the film's really about, and that's certainly at the heart of what we've come to feel making this film and traveling across America, meeting all these people, I mean hundreds, is that music is the one thing that unites the races. Music is the communication that transcends everything else. And it's music that actually brings people together, and it's music that puts an African American in a white person's home before any government decree or law, or any book or article in a newspaper. It's a record that brings those ideas, and a record brings those ideas and those feelings into someone's home. And how we appreciate other cultures generally is first through music. I mean, before reggae took off with Bob Marley, most people could have written what they knew about Jamaica on the back of a postage stamp. It was music that made an awareness of the West Indies. That's how we hear about those cultures. And because generally film doesn't, from other cultures, doesn't penetrate to the same degree popular music does. So I think music was actually something that brought these cultures together. And they were all listening and playing with each other. And I'm always bemused by the kind of some of the really weird theories you read in books about this person influenced this person. It's not as clean as that. Everything is bleeding one into the other. I mean, you could certainly make a strong case that there's a lot of, Irish folk music in blues. And if you talk to someone like Taj, he would absolutely agree with you. He would also probably say that there's a lot of Native American music in some of the Delta blues, because there was a lot of Native American blood within the people like Patton that were making that music. So there really is a huge commingling. I mean, every single African American blues performer was a massive fan of Jimmy Rogers. I mean, they all had Jimmy Rogers records. You saw Jimmy Rogers records were advertised in all the African American newspapers at the time. So there's a big crossover. It's just the thing that fools people is it's not always the people that you would think liking the things you would think. I remember years ago meeting some of these early hip-hop artists from the 80s, and they basically thought Gary Newman was a god. Gary Newman and Twohy Army. Now, they're not into some white dude that's doing soul music. They're into a white guy that's doing some robotic shtick that is about as far away from African American culture as you can get. And we tend to be drawn to things that are really different and look different from what we know. And so I just thought it was amusing that there was that that there's always been the commingling of those cultures and those ideas. So I kind of I think that was really, for me, the film is about saying all these radically different cultures are in the same country. That's why America is such an incredible and beautiful place. And we had literally the most wonderful, luckiest experience of a lifetime to be able to travel in a really deep way through all these different bits of America. And I swear to God, when you travel from New York through the Appalachians, down into Mississippi, Louisiana, Texas, Hopi, then over to Hawaii, the idea that one person in Washington, D.C. is the president of all this is mind-boggling.
Yes. Absolutely.
It's staggering that all this is actually is one country.
Yeah.
And that's an incredible thing. And as you say, when you travel to America, you see parts of old Britain, where we came from, that are untouched. You see people with old British cultures that,
Especially in South Carolina.
Down there. I hear too in West Virginia. I wanted to bring up, maybe this is a good time, the importance of gospel music. It's kind of essential. Can you talk to that?
Well, it's spiritual, and I think that spiritual music has a power to it, and an energy and a passion that you can't approximate in the secular world. And I think an example that people will appreciate. I grew up listening to a lot of reggae music as a kid, and since the Rastafarianism, the religion, has gone out of the music and it's become dancehall, I just don't think the music has anywhere near the same commercial and global reach it once did. What people were drawn to, most people didn't really understand Rastafarianism, but they were drawn to the spirituality of the music, the fact that the people singing it, whether it was Winston Rodney in Burning Spear or Bob Marley, had this absolutely unshakable passion and belief in what they were projecting. And that spiritual belief is even more powerful than being in love with your partner. It's a higher thing. And so I think these preachers in the South were fundamental to the emancipation of the African American people, as they told me. And those preachers, those church services, say at Triumph, would last the entire day. I'm literally repeating what Ted and the guys there would tell me. And a lot of the time, people like Birch would be up in the pulpit and they would be talking about issues, social issues that related to them, and being proud and standing up for themselves. I mean, Birch came back and we met an old lady that was too old to interview for the film. She was like 98, wasn't she?
Yes. And
she remembered Birch in the 20s building the church when she was a little girl with his bare hands. And so he would be standing up and he would be the person that would be putting forward those ideas about how there was equality was needed, how people need to stand up, how they needed to, and the church was their inspiration in that. And you can see, if you're trying to track these people down, when you're looking through the African American papers like the Pittsburgh Courier and the Chicago Defender, all these people like Levi Bird and Birch are speaking to each other in these columns in the paper. And those newspapers most people were distributing those newspapers like Levi Bird in Chiraw. They were getting those papers sent and they were distributing them on street corners because they wanted their fellow people to read those words and find out what was going on in the cities. I think the church it was incredibly important for those people, and I think in the kind of secular era we're living in now, I think it's easy to forget how important that spirituality can be. And I think Dizzy says in his book, the most he says something like the closest to the New Testament is those sanctified churches, which those churches look down on, where people are really losing it and getting into it. But if you see those kind of performances, it just sweeps you. You get swept up in it. I mean, when we filmed that, when we got all the Triumph Choir members from the Triumph Choir from around America to come to the little church, it was really difficult to film it because it's really hard to concentrate on shooting something when that's going off in front of you. It's so explosive, the emotion, that you have to be constantly pinching yourself to remind yourself to stay on point. So I think gospel music it's in the very kind of rubric of all good contemporary music, that it's it's a commonly known thing that a lot of the greatest rhythm and blues music came from people being in the church and singing in the church. And people sing better that have been in churches. People who've sung in churches sing better, because they learn to sing out from a young age. So you project better. So I think even on a practical, physical level, the church makes better singers.
All right.
But yeah.
So one of the reasons why we were keen to have you at the Library of Congress and to show your film here and to talk about the film was that there's footage from our collections in the film, and I'm going to tell a little bit of the story of some footage, which then you'll pick up on and tell the rest of it. So this is footage of Honeyboy Edwards, whom you've already mentioned, who passed away a few years ago, sadly. But this footage was made by Alan Lomax in 1942 when he was doing recording for the Library of Congress in Mississippi. And he brought along a silent film camera, color film, and he filmed some of the artists that he recorded. And out of this footage, he put together a demonstration reel that he would take around and show to people about what he had done in Mississippi. And other people brought this demonstration reel around as well. And over time, this reel got very ratty, and the color faded, and it was labeled. And we don't know who did the labeling. It was back in the 1940s. It could have been Alan himself, but it was probably someone else. So the individual segments of this film were labeled, and one of them was labeled Charles Edwards, which was not Honeyboy Edwards' name. His name was David Edwards. And so we just assumed that this was film of some guy named Charles Edwards, which would not have been that significant necessarily in the history of American music. But at some point, our curator of the Lomax collection, whose name is Todd Harvey, whom you met a little earlier, Todd had this insight, and it was actually, I was the person he was talking to. We were sitting in the reading room, and he said to me, why would Lomax film this guy playing the guitar, but then not record his music? There's no recordings from anyone named Charles Edwards in the collection. And I said, that's a really good point. And we both sort of said, you don't think they could be? Nah, it couldn't be. Because Honeyboy had gone on to be a Grammy-winning artist and, Blues Hall of Fame and one of the great blues artists of the 20th and 21st centuries. So I wouldn't let this go. I kind of went and did a little legwork, and I started reading both Lomax's accounts of his meetings with Honeyboy and Honeyboy's accounts, because he wrote an autobiography. And the reason this was difficult to determine was that there was no other picture of Honeyboy known for 25 years after this event. Even Honeyboy in his own book had no pictures of himself to print. So his appearance had just changed a lot in those 25 years, and it was not immediately obvious that this was him. But I started to read these accounts, and the hat was right, and the thumb pick was right, and the guitar was right. And I said, this has got to be Honeyboy Edwards. So we bundled the film together. We got a good transfer from the original, which looks beautiful, as you know, and we sent it to Michael Frank, who had been Honeyboy's sideman and manager for many years. Unfortunately, Honeyboy had just died a year before we made this. That we had this insight, but we sent it to Michael, and Michael showed it to Honeyboy's stepdaughter, and he communicated to us that her immediate phrase on seeing this film was, "That's my daddy," and so that's how we knew that was Honeyboy. And then we were really tickled when you used this footage in the film. So explain how you used it, because you synced it up amazingly with Honeyboy's music. So explain how you used it and how you found out about it.
One of the things that got American Epic started was Michael Frank.
Mm-hmm.
A friend of ours, Garth Cartwright, who mentioned earlier, had approached us and said, "Do you know that these three bluesmen are coming to a festival in the Lake District to play?" And nobody knows about it. It's run by some wealthy guy, and he just brings in blues musicians he likes and doesn't do any national promotion. Just the locals come. And he wanted to have the three oldest blues musicians, and so I had found out that Michael Frank looked after all of them: Lockwood, Homesick, and Honeyboy. So I called Michael and said, "Could we come up and film them? Money will change hands if need be." And he said, "Sure." I said, "When are they free?" He said, "We're completely free. No one knows we're here, apart from the gig." And so I came up and shot. That's how I met Michael, and spent this entire day with all three of them, interviewing each of them for a couple of hours each, and then I think an hour or so with all three of them together. And we used a part of that in the film. And so then when you made this discovery, which is amazing. This is very strange having this interview, right. Because this is brought the genesis of the project full circle, basically.
Mm-hmm. Wow!
So that's the very beginning of the whole American Epic search, was doing that interview. Mm-hmm. I did that because I thought this needs to be filmed, and one day I'll probably need it. That's why I shot it.
And I'm really glad you did, because Honeyboy's gone, and
And then to have those three guys, so the mountains of other stuff they talked about is just incredible. I just love to. I think one day I'd like to put that up online, just so people can just watch the unedited interview. It's really hilarious, and they go all over the place. I mean, all these musicians they knew. But anyway, so Michael's called me and he told me that you'd made this discovery, and that he knew we were going to do a piece. This was after you'd found it, and said, I can speak to the Library of Congress and give permission for you to use it, for you to use it in your film. So I was kind of over the moon that this had turned up, and then I spoke to Todd, and it just seemed it was like one of those moments that I saw it just seemed too good to be true. It seemed staggering that someone had shot this.
It seemed too good to be true to us, and Todd really had that great insight that it's got to be something other than what it appears to be.
So I'd heard something about it. As I said, you would have thought it had been done the same day he'd been recorded, but it wasn't.
Right.
And I don't know where I heard this, but I was told that when Lomax was shooting him, he wanted to record him, and that Honeyboy had said something to the effect, "I'm making too much money on this corner, come back another time." And they arranged another time. But I don't know where, I have to say it wasn't germane to the film, and I just don't remember where I heard this, but generally these things pan out. I remember, they stick in my mind. However, I got hold of all the recordings that Lomax had made shortly after he shot that. I think was it a week or two later?
I think it was, yeah.
And I hired a lip reader to try and decipher what he was singing. Couldn't do it. Then I hired another lip reader. Couldn't do it. Then I hired another lip reader. They couldn't do it. I got to 5 lip readers, all of whom I paid, until eventually I found a lip reader that identified 2 words that he was saying. And that, I went back to the tapes and I went, oh my God, this is largely from Army Blues. One of the songs he recorded, he was actually singing one of the songs. And so our engineer, Peter Henderson, who was and I think it's Army Blues, and I think the other one's called West Coast, or was it Waterfront? It's Water Blues or something. There's a fragment of that, because he's taking different clips.
Right, yeah.
He's actually doing 2 songs.
Yeah.
The bulk of it's Army Blues. And Peter Henderson, who worked on a lot of the sound for American Epic, is a genius. Won his first Grammy at 21, and produced Breakfast in America for Supertramp. He's a wonderful guy, huge important figure in this film in terms of always guiding us in the right approach. And I said, Peter, do you think you can sync this? And he went, you've got to be kidding. And he said, this guy I don't think has ever played the same song in the same way twice in his life. But he did. He did a really amazing job.
Really good job.
Yeah, he did.
And so that's basically, he's playing the same song. And so it was incredible. It was like that was like this really amazing moment. And
it's funny. That he was playing Army Blues, which was very much on his mind, because when Lomax met him, he was going off to be drafted, and the reason that Lomax lost touch with him for many, many years was that he assumed that he had been drafted, but in fact he managed to talk his way out of the draft by claiming an injury, and that injury is a dent in his head that he got from being hit by a bottle of soda that was thrown at him. And that dent is one of the ways that people were able to identify that this actually was footage of him. So it all goes around.
Oh, that's incredible! Yeah. And then what was wonderful was that there was all this other beautiful footage that you transferred of kids dancing nearby, which we also used at the end of the film. And there was something very touching about that. Those young African American girls dancing in the field, and I love old photographs of people happy decades and decades ago and wondering what happened to them.
Yeah.
There's an innocence about it. It's very emotional. So that for that reason, we decided in the film that there were quite a lot of dissolves between stills from the 20s and 30s, and then we dissolved to footage of that same place. So we were all the time tramping around where we were doing the interviews. It used to take, I remember our line producer would be constantly tapping his watch, and we were trying to find the exact location of where that still had been taken so I could match the frame, and that you could dissolve so that people could see how places in America looked then and how they look now.
Right.
And so that's a kind of a metaphor for, walking by and just always you walk past every door and every street, just thinking for a minute what that building may have housed 80 years ago, 100 years ago, who might have been in there and what they might have been doing.
It's a great segue to the question of how you melded archival footage. I mean, you said one way, dissolve into the contemporary footage, but I'm sure there are other ways that you worked with both contemporary and archival footage in the film.
Well, we developed a new technique that we invented for using archival footage that a couple of really sharp cinematographers have spotted. But most people just go, it looks really nice.
Yeah.
They don't actually know why.
That would be me.
It's all scanned at really high resolution, sometimes as high as 8K. we went to great efforts to ensure that everything was original prints, so that it felt as tangible as possible, like the music. But what we did with the archive footage is, one of the issues you have with historical documentaries is and you see this in all of them, they do something on a film. The aspect ratio, which is the shape of the image, has changed over the years, and now we're in a sort of letterbox format for a film. But in the 20s and into the 50s, even, we were dealing with a 4:3 aspect ratio, which is essentially more like a square. And so what filmmakers have done in documentary since there were documentaries in the modern format, is they punch into the footage. That is to say, they zoom into the footage so that image fills the whole screen. And I'm not knocking it, if that's what you like, but you are basically losing a massive amount of what that original cameraman framed up. And I think in historical things and in everything, context is everything. You need to see the whole picture. So I like total truth in documentary. So in my view is just, you have the people, the family talking, you see the real photographs, and you show as much of everything as possible. So what we did is we did a technique called overscanning, which is where we scan the entire film, which showing the frame. So this would normally be cut off, so you see the curved edges of the frame. And then we would scan the leader of the film, which is like the black leader, which is the celluloid or the nitrate before you get to the film, before you get to the actual images. And that would be superimposed at the side of the screen. So you actually have the grain of that film at the side of the screen. So basically the picture is never retracting and expanding as it would when you were moving from contemporary footage to old footage. It is always full screen. So you're not only seeing the entirety of the 20s picture with no cropping. In fact, you're seeing more than you would have seen when it was projected, because there would have been some cropping of those edges. But also the entire picture is breathing. And so we devised that technique to use this material so that we could comfortably move in and out of the old and the new. And that was it, really. And then the other thing is just sense of momentum. I shot all the interviews, much to the chagrin of my cinematographer, on a slider or a dolly. That is a device that allows the camera to move from left to right. And so this gentle movement is happening, but the idea is to mimic the feeling of the way your head looks when you're staring at somebody. If you're in a situation of conversation with somebody, your head is not held by a metal clamp, so you're unmoving, and you are moving, and you're constantly looking around and at the sides of the people. So the sense was, but not more, So essentially, it's to mimic the feeling. If I was standing on a porch talking to somebody, I would be looking at them slightly from the left and right, and it's to mimic that feeling of being there. But it also creates a sense of momentum, which, interesting enough, blends the old footage with the new footage with the old footage better.
Interesting.
Yeah.
That's fascinating to me. Wow.
Yeah. That's just tricks of the trade I've never talked about before.
All right. Well, I think we're probably running low on time, so we should talk very briefly about some of the related products that you've come out with in addition to the film itself. One thing that really interests me is the box set, which, you talked about the influence of the Harry Smith anthology in the film, and this is sort of a similar concept. How did you conceptualize the set?
Well, the set is 100, maybe 100. As I mentioned, 100 groups or musicians were researched for the film across all these different genres of music. I wanted American Epic to have all the kinds of indigenous music in it that other sets before hadn't included. So the Hispanic the African American, the Hawaiian. I wanted all those things to be in it because they're such an important part of the mix. And sorry, the Native American. And so in doing that and looking at the artists that should be in the film, we came up with the idea of having what we thought were the 100 of the most powerful songs, performances from that era, as a method of having something people could really dive into, and they could experience just how colourful this period was. And this is really a metaphor for how we should be proceeding today. I mean, what they were doing then is what should be happening now. We should be embracing
Right.
that level of, and actually the doorway's become much more restricted since that time in terms of what gets in front of the public, or what's available to the public. And so this was a method of saying, here are 100 of the greatest parts. And American Epic is, as a film, it's what Anthony Wall would describe as non-didactic. It's not a scientific project. It's an emotional response to music and a culture that we love, and it's basically the reason. It's a reason why we love America. It's two Brits and one American putting onto film what we love about America, and we're doing it at the point when America really kind of explodes and comes into its own, which is the 20s, and the world is still kind of in the thrall of what America developed in the 20s, and so those songs are. When you watch the American Epic films, the visual metaphor we use to convey how the film's being approached is an old record album that's kind of pulled off the shelf, and we see the book open, and these were these old leather-bound books that people would put their records in.
Actual albums.
Yeah, that's where the term album comes from. It was like a photo album, except it had your records in it. And a few years later, record companies come up with the idea, why don't we put someone's photograph and have all one person's records in there? But before then, you'd buy these leather-bound books and you'd put your singles, if you will, in that, and that would become your record album. And so you see that book turning and you see the records, and we zoom in on a record and we hear the story behind that record. Some are an artist you might have heard of, and many you will never have heard of. And the idea we're suggesting is that there are hundreds of thousands of these records, and here are 10 of these stories. Go forth and explore yourself, because behind every one there may be a story like this. And so the box set is a method of going into 100 of those things, and you can start to extrapolate from looking at the film what the stories are about those. So the box set has lyrics transcribed for all the songs, which many have never been transcribed before, and again, in an emotional response as opposed to historical, we have quotes from the artists or their family about every single one. It was incredibly hard to find that once you say, oh, we're going to do this for everyone. It was really difficult. And stills for most of them. I mean, there's many, many people that music fans in there have never seen before. But the big breakthrough is the sound.
Yeah, we
And
wanted to talk about that.
that's a huge part of American Epic. In a music film, or in any film, sound is 50% of movie. And yet sound is often a big neglected part of features. It's like a poor cousin.
Right.
It's a thing that's generally tossed off at the end. So here, when we had the Western Electric recording system, and Nick Berg, our engineer, had got that machine working, we recorded all the contemporary artists on it first. What was amazing was that I suddenly could hear how the old records are meant to sound, because I was hearing Willie Nelson or Elton John on that machine. I could, in my mind's ear, hear how John Hurt was meant to sound, how those records were meant to sound, because we were the first people in almost 80 years that were using this machinery that made those records. And so I spoke to Nick and said, look, how would you feel about doing some serious R&D work using what we've learned recording this to transfer these records? And Nick, being the highly professional individual he is, kind of put that off for months and months and months, but he was actually doing it. He just didn't want to say he was going to do it until he figured he could make a significant improvement. And he said, okay, I'll do it, by which point he'd actually figured it out. And so he was able to transfer these old records and bring things out in them that we'd never heard before. But the main thing is they were really musical. The transfers sounded really, really musical. They had a kind of musicality and nuance to them that I'd never heard. And there were songs that these songs were making me feel things that I had never felt before. And so we asked him to get involved in transferring all the discs for the compilation as well as the film. And what I noticed that I'd never heard before is that the trouble with the 20s music is that the discs they recorded to were often so gnarly, and it's so difficult for people to know how to play them back, that the problem you have is that after 4 or 5 songs, your ears get really tired and you can't listen to it anymore. And you want to put a modern recording on that's made on tape or something. Here on this box set, you don't have that effect anymore. You can just listen to the song after song. They just roll into each other because they have a musicality, a flow to them. But they also have a clarity. And so the engineers, Peter Henderson and Joel Teftella, they did just insane amounts of work manually removing all the clicks from these records, without putting them through processing and stuff like this. So that everything sounds very open, like there's lots of air. You can really hear the room. You can just, when you hear the recordings, you can hear the sound of the record, the performance as it echoes around the room that they're in recording it.
And you actually have before and after of the recording to kind of compare the improvement.
Yes.
I mean, we can play you an example of one of these discs, how they would sound like if you transferred them on a normal turntable, and then we can play an example of how they sound like now when they've been transferred through the system. And so they're
And then we can play a reimagined version where we re-record the song in the present day on the same machine.
Yeah, with the contemporary artists doing it. But so there are 12 album releases. There's the box set, there's a soundtrack, and then there are 10 artists and genre compilations. So there's all of John Hurt's recordings, there's a selection of the Memphis Jug Band stuff. It's pretty
It's
pretty
extensive.
deep. It's very extensive, yeah.
And you have your companion book too, beautiful, beautiful companion book with all of these photographs. It felt like a scrapbook that's kind of done up right.
And an award-winning book, we should say.
Yeah.
Oh, thank you. Yeah, we wanted to let the reader feel like they were on the journey with us, understanding how Bernard did the research and what it was like to be traveling across America, meeting these people.
Yeah, that's like a kind of we got asked a lot about making the films, and so the book is, all the parts are meant to be really essentially somewhat exclusive, so that's really the insight of how the thing was put together, and it's an opportunity to tell a lot of stories you can't tell in a film. But
And Elijah Wald.
Oh, he's wonderful. Yeah.
You worked with him on the book.
Elijah's fantastic. He's like a scientist with words.
Yeah.
He was really helpful. He came in and went through the narration before we went to see Redford with it, and recorded it. And Elijah's got a wonderfully acute eye and ear for exactly what a sentence is saying. Because here, you raised this thing about the question about the slide guitar earlier, and where it came from, and I just present the information we found. I just think it's not possible to be absolute about any of these things. And so there are statements you have to make in a film where, as emotionally as you're trying to tell the story and letting people tell their own words, we have to steer the audience from room to room. And Elijah was very helpful in having a line of narration not say more than it was meant to say. Yeah,
That's key.
it's very important with a
We know
historical
this
thing.
in radio.
You gotta be, yeah. Anything else?
Let's see. I think we covered a lot of
we've
ground.
covered a lot of ground,
Yeah.
and I think we have to get you over to sound check so that we
Okay.
can actually get your movie screen tonight.
Okay.
So once again, these are the producers and director and writer of American Epic, which was a series of films that became a series on PBS. Mary Sue Twohy from Sirius XM Radio, and my name is Steve Winick. I work here at the Library of Congress in the American Folklife Center. Thanks very much.
Thank you.
This has been a presentation of the Library of Congress. Visit us at loc.gov.